The Ukraine conflict is the first full-blown war on the European continent since ethnic tensions ripped apart Yugoslavia back in the early 1990s. In this episode of the Reenactor's Corner, we ask why a conflict on the other side of Europe is shutting down World War II reenacting events in the UK. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Reenactor's Corner podcast. This is Chris here again with Ben. How are you doing, Ben?
Great, Chris. Great to be back.
We are excited today to have a special guest. He has been on the podcast before, and we are happy to have him back. Ludwig Topf, thanks for coming back on.
Great to be on again.
So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to chat with you because our topic today is basically how the current war in Ukraine has affected reenactment events. And it has definitely affected reenacting for me in some ways in terms of availability of reproduction items, and there's considerations there for sure. But Ludwig, I think it has probably impacted people from what I'm seeing online in reenactor chat on the internet. I think it's affecting reenactors in the United Kingdom more. So I'm interested in hearing kind of your take on what the situation is like for you there.
Yeah, there has been a significant backlash for a lot of events, a lot of big public events as a result of this. And an almost hysterical response from some of the event organizers in that they have either decided or been told by sort of the senior management for these events to close them as a result of the war in Ukraine. And obviously in terms of what that means for reenacting is sort of 3 years, approaching 3 years on the trot of limited events or less events and a lot of big events cancelled as a result of that.
I saw that the sort of Hop Farm War and Peace show, which I actually went to in 2018, was cancelled. Was that because of this?
I am not sure if it was cancelled specifically because of the Ukraine situation, the Ukraine war, because I've heard differing sort of things on this. I think I would assume it is because of, or at least in part because of, but the announcement that they've made on their website, I think, is a bit different to that. With regards to logistics and infrastructure and so on, being a reason that they can't host it. It may well be the case that is, just something that they've said to move away from that. I don't know. I couldn't say with certainty, so that's just speculation on my part.
Sure, it's hard to know, and yeah.
Yeah, War and Peace was never an event. I attended War and Peace years ago. Funnily enough, that I think I was there the same year that the 2008 documentary Weekend Nazis came out, which wasn't great for a lot of reasons. Yeah.
No, I imagine not.
Yeah, but I mean, a really big show cancelled again, and I think one interesting thing that I wanted to sort of bring to your attention, guys, was something I read that had been sent out to Soviet reenactors attending a show. It's not a show that I attend, but it's a big show down south. And if I can just read it out, just a little bit of here. It is with regret that we must decline your group's attendance at this year's show. This will affect all Russian and Cold War depiction groups. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has brought us to this decision. We were hoping, against hope, that a ceasefire and withdrawal of Russian troops may have occurred, which would have eased the situation, and so much so on in this vein. But also they are concerned about people blockading the showground entrance to protest Russian, Soviet reenactors being present whilst the war in Ukraine is ongoing, which would then result, as they put it, and this is quoting them exactly, all of which will depict the show in a bad light. So that's essentially, not only are events being cancelled, but Soviet reenactors, often reenactors who have supported the same shows for years and years, are essentially now being said that they're, being told that they're persona non grata. Which is, in my view, absolutely disgusting, but I'm sure we can get into that.
That absolutely sounds shocking and insane on so many different levels.
It just sounds very reactionary to me, and just sort of short-sighted, lumping people all into one group, generalizing. Yeah.
I just don't understand how you're going to have a public display event where you allow people to portray the military of the Nazi Germany, but people who are portraying the military of one of the participants on the winning team who are allied with the Western Allies, that this is somehow inconceivable now because of modern political events that have literally nothing to do with the Soviet Union at all. I mean, it just seems so obtuse. I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It seems absolutely crazy.
I mean, lest we forget that Russia and Ukraine were part of the Soviet Union. They were one country in World War II. They're Soviet war heroes who are Ukrainian, which is, just fascinating to think of.
We brought this up a little bit on the Facebook page for the podcast, and one of the listeners made, I think, a really astute point that there have been wars in recent years in which British soldiers fought and died, and reenactment events related to historical wars were allowed to continue. But now there's this current war that theoretically doesn't involve the British military, and yet for some reason now, this war, it's like a step too far to have military war reenactment. I don't even understand the viewpoint. I can't make any sense of it.
Yeah, that does seem just odd.
Well, it's ridiculous and it's totally knee-jerk. And a lot of it is, as it was with COVID, is almost a virtue signaling reaction to a lot of this stuff. Like, people didn't necessarily care about this a lot, although this situation in Ukraine has essentially been brewing for the last 30 years. People now suddenly care about it. It's on their minds, and that's what, they want to be seen to be front of the queue and being virtuous about being sensitive towards it. Now, in the last couple of weeks, I've been to shows with Soviet reenactors, very well-attended public events, and I've been there with a good friend of mine who's a Soviet reenactor, walking through the streets. We did not have a single comment. Obviously, I was in German uniform, so you get the usual comments that you get at any public show, which, if anything, is one of the main reasons, as we've discussed, not to go to them, but that's a whole separate discussion. But he didn't have any comments whatsoever. And the key thing behind that was that most people don't recognize the Soviet uniform, the Red Army uniform at first glance. But also, when people did ask what he was portraying, and we talked to them about it, there were no nasty comments. It was just sort of jokingly, "Oh, you'll not be popular at the moment now," sort of thing. So I think from the organizer's perspective, it's a total knee-jerk reaction to what's actually happening. I think most people probably can differentiate between Soviet Second World War reenacting and the events currently taking place in the Ukraine. But I think on all of these committees that organise events, there's at least somebody who's always going to go, "Oh, well, what about this? And we have to change the event for this." And I'm seeing events that are having Ukrainian flags flown, and which really, when you think about it, is also inappropriate, because then you're tying reenacting to a current political event, which I think should, you should also be working to avoid that as well. So in that sense, I don't think the public are, if they're going to go to an event, as you say, if they're going to go to an event and see reenactors portraying the Waffen SS, I don't see how they can get worried about seeing Red Army reenactors.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. I mean, I have my own reservations about doing public events because of, backlash to a German uniform, and now I thought Soviet was safe, and I guess Soviet is not safe, at least from the organizer's perspective. Whether or not people can recognize what the uniform is. I mean, yeah.
It's just, it's so baffling to me. I'm interested in history. I do this stuff because I'm interested in this historical period. I just can't imagine that there could be any modern current event that could take place that would change my perception of something that happened decades before I was born. My historical interest is just totally not tied to the modern geopolitical situation at all. And to see that there's this war that's going on, and that it's kind of having an effect on historical reenactment, I suppose one could make some sort of a claim, right? I would not make this claim, but I guess I could see that someone might make the assertion that doing some kind of war reenactment during an actual wartime is somehow in poor taste or whatever, but particularly where the war that we're describing here is not taking place in the countries in which we live and doesn't theoretically involve the militaries of the nations in which we live. And the fact that historical reenactment of wars did take place during the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, these wars that did have American and British military involvement, it just seems so strange to me. And I suspect that it has to do with the sort of a social or cultural change that is going on in our world at present, more than it is even about this particular military conflict, that it's just like a social change on the whole.
I mean, I feel like as a society, and this is a total sort of aside that could be untrue from a psychological perspective, but as a society, I feel like we kind of need an enemy, and Russia under Mr. Putin has become the enemy of society that in the eyes of many, and so all of a sudden Russia is bad, and anything that could be construed as being associated with Russia, including historical reenactment of a different country that preceded, the current Russian Federation, is now seen as bad. Feel free to jump on that, Ludwig or Chris.
Yeah, I feel that you are absolutely right, and it has gone to insane lengths now, to the extent where people won't buy Russian products, they won't, they won't deal with Russian people, and it is part of this thing where society has to have a current issue, a current target, something to focus on, and I think it's you could go into the sort of psychological element about it a lot. But for us as reenactors, obviously it means that Soviet reenactors are now the sort of persona non grata, and they end up with that bad reputation. But it is interesting to see in terms of where you're talking about the tastelessness, if you wanted to put it that way. I can understand why people would be opposed to having battle reenactments at a time when there's an ongoing conflict, but as you say, there have been wars ongoing for the last, the entire time I've been reenacting, there have been wars going, and it hasn't stopped reenactors from shooting at each other in a public bowling green or running about an MOD training site, shooting at each other there either. So we were at a public event, a sort of private event recently, but which also crossed across public ground, because it can be difficult in areas in England to have public bridleways restricted in areas where you might be doing a reenacting event that's a sort of tactical event a little bit out of the way. There might still be some public access to the site, and we were portraying. It was a 5-day reenacting event, and we were portraying sort of German forces at the latter end of the war, and we had reached the end of our ammunition and were surrendering to the Americans, and they marched us down to this sort of containment area, and it was really immersive, and it was great. And there was all of the Americans sort of standing about in their GMC trucks and their Jeeps and so on, and we were just sat down looking depressed as authentically as possible. And I didn't notice this until it was already ongoing, but a Land Rover had pulled up with a big Ukrainian flag on the front and a stop the war sign. And a very cross gentleman was shouting at some of the American reenactors about how it was disgusting and that the war needed to be stopped and that this was totally inappropriate. And then he started trying to take pictures of us, so there was a duck and dash to get out of the way before that could happen, and he was driving his Land Rover about the place. It was just one of the most bizarre things I've seen at a reenacting event. And it was very, very uncomfortable to have to deal with that. But I think that, especially over in the UK, but perhaps also in the United States, you guys might get this as well, as people that have fixated so much on this conflict and made it so much a part of their identity, in the absence of everything else, in order to go on like this and to act like this towards reenactors. And I think there will probably be some more of that, especially at the bigger events that are to take place throughout the summer in the UK, the big public events. I think we will more than likely see some more of that as well.
Well, Chris and I heard an account from somebody we know locally, who was at an event, I guess last weekend, and they were doing Yugoslavian partisan from World War II, and I guess because even though their camp was clearly identified in English with a sign saying they were portraying Yugoslavian, people basically saw their flag, and because of its similarity to the Russian flag, they basically were making rude comments to these people who were, portraying a faction from World War II, from a country that doesn't from another country that doesn't exist anymore. And our associate basically said that the kind of funny thing about this all was that these people were old enough to... They should have been able to remember when America was actually involved in the Balkan Wars in the 90s. And so it would not surprise me if stuff continues to unravel and go sideways this summer.
It's just really shocking. I mean, to think that there was a local reenactment here, a public display, where the people who were reenacting Yugoslavian partisans were taking more heat from the public than the people who were reenacting the Waffen-SS at that event.
Yeah.
It's crazy. I mean, there on some level, as much as I find all of this to be reprehensible, and as someone who does World War II Soviet reenacting, I totally feel the pain and empathize with people who are finding their reenactment opportunities limited because of this thing. Despite all that, there is a certain element here for me, if I'm speaking honestly, of schadenfreude, where I know that I've talked to a lot of Soviet reenactors over the years who are like, I don't know how you can do German. I don't know how in this society you think it's, you don't find that people are going to automatically react horribly to any kind of German Nazi uniform, and I don't have the balls to do it. I'm going to do Soviet because it's safe and it's cool. And then all of a sudden, these people are doing something that's not safe and not cool anymore either. And it's like, well, how does it feel now?
Yeah,
it does seem. Yeah, sorry, Ludwig, go ahead.
I completely agree with that, and in the sense that, yes, I understand the position of the Soviet reenactors, but it is nice to not be the baddest guy there. And at every public event that we've been to recently, or every private event where we've accidentally bumped into members of the public and they've sort of seen this column of Germans looking haggard marching along and sort of asked us what on earth are you doing, every single time I say to them, oh, we're off to fight the Russians, or we're off to stop the Russians, and the response is always positive and go get them sort of thing. So at least we've got some way to no longer seem the baddest guys.
That's really funny. I should steal that one.
Definitely. I would encourage everybody to do that.
I see I think I would describe it as cognitive dissonance from some people that I know who reenact World War II Soviet, where I think they're struggling a little bit with, they used to have this kind of get out of jail free card. I shoot fascists on the weekend. They have the moral high ground. They have the mainstream approved position, and then all of a sudden these people I think are scrambling because it's like, oh geez, now I'm going to be maybe looked at and people are going to think I'm weird or whatever, or I might have to answer an uncomfortable question or try to diffuse a potentially awkward confrontational type situation, and it's just like, I don't know, I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it definitely is funny to see somebody who's not a World War II German reenactor faced with that.
Yeah, they've been effectively debased, which is, yeah, it's strange really to see. I didn't expect it myself.
So, Ludwig, before we go any further, I mean, Ben and I only have a very narrow and limited window into what reenacting is like in the UK and in Europe. I mean, would you say there have been like several events that have been either canceled or stripped down or otherwise affected by this modern turn of events?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to begin with, the biggest thing for all the public reenactors, public-facing reenactors, and I know we've talked about this when I was on here, the first time I was on here, but the public railway events. And forgive me if I'm getting some of the terms wrong here. I don't put much stock into these events, but for a weekend to get away, I guess that some people do quite enjoy them. But the association, or the Heritage Railway Association, which was responsible for the management of some of the largest sort of heritage railways in the UK, essentially operated a blanket ban on all World War II events and told the local organisers for these railways that World War II events would not be tolerated and that they were not acceptable. So effectively, the organisers for these events were told, no World War II events, no sort of Germans, no battles, certainly no Soviets, and that's how it's got to be across the whole of all of their different sites. So that was, for a lot of people, we had straight away, for some of the sort of more public-facing groups that I know, 2 major shows straight away gone, and then obviously a lot of little shows as well. 2 of these shows I know were shows that they had supported for years, and supported, at their own cost. As we've discussed, reenactors travel to events at their own cost, they set up at their own cost, they take their own time, often time off work, in order to do that. So that was a blow to them to see those events cancelled. But then, in justifying this decision, the chairman, I believe, of the Heritage Railway Association went on BBC Radio 2, where he was interviewed by Jeremy Vine, and sort of went on a long discourse about how reenacting at this time is distasteful and not appropriate. And I think that it would be really useful if a lot of the reenactors that go to these events and patronise these public events look back on this and realise that actually the people that run these sites really have very little respect for reenactors at all. That would maybe be a useful time to start moving away from these sorts of gigs, as it were. But beyond that, there's just been a rash of events of all different types and sizes cancelling in direct response to the Ukraine situation, and saying that they find it not appropriate to host events at the moment. I can think of some off the top of my head, but I know that equally some of the biggest shows of the year are still set to go ahead. I organise a small event based near where I live, and I've sort of said to the Soviet reenacting groups that I know, you're more than welcome to come. If any members of the public are rude, if they're really, really causing trouble, we can look at making sure that there are people on site to make sure that doesn't happen. And I personally wouldn't tolerate abuse of Soviet reenactors, because I'm intelligent enough to work out that the 2 things are completely distinct, even though some people seem to have trouble working that out. So, any Soviet reenactors in the UK listening to this, you can get my details from Chris and come to my event, because we can always use more reenactors there. But broadly speaking, I think, like COVID, it's just going to be another year where shows are radically reduced and curtailed, and it will just force more and more people that want to continue to do the hobby to look at private events, to look at organising these things independently of event organisers, of site ownership. And that obviously does present some difficulty for some people, and a lot of people choose to do reenacting to deal with the public-facing events, but maybe that's, it's added an additional element to the already difficult side for German reenactors, is that you now also have events just being cancelled for things like this as well, for Soviet reenactors, for German reenactors, for everybody.
That is unfortunate. I mean, on a personal level, and I know things are different in the UK, but reenacting, for me, I prefer to have like a personal experience. I prefer to not have to deal with the public. But that said, there's a time and a place for a public event, and there's some public events that I do miss going to that have been cancelled because of COVID or other things, and that I wish I could go to again. And so it's sad across the board. It's an L for everybody.
Ludwig, I'm absolutely thunderstruck by what you're describing. I mean, I actually didn't even realize until hearing it from you just how extensive this really is. It's just shocking. I mean, I never could have predicted this. It seems totally ridiculous. I just don't understand it.
Well, like I said, it comes from this sort of, and I hate to bang on about it because I don't want to tie into the political thing at all, if avoidable, but in order to explain the way that it goes on, it ties into the virtual signalling thing, and people want to be at the front of the queue for proving that when this is all cracking off, they were the ones that were most in step with the consensus opinion. And so as a result, on all of these committees that organise these events, whether they're independent or whether they are overseen by some oversight body, like, for example, the railway events are sometimes overseen by the Heritage Railway Association. Regardless of whether it's that kind of arrangement, you will have maybe at least somebody on the committee organising who will raise concerns about whether the event is appropriate. And I think that there are things that reenactors can do to have a measured response to this, and maybe choose not to do public battle reenactments, keep it just as living history, in order to respond to that. But I think you are always going to have this, regardless of where things go, where people are always going to see current events and use them to shut things down. And it was the same with COVID, where we could have had outdoor events that would have been reasonably safe, And in line with the guidelines of the time, they changed so much in the UK, but in line with the guidelines of the time, we could have still had outdoor events that would have been acceptable to the guidelines, and still event organisers were shutting these down. So you have to bear that in mind as well. It's really, for me personally, and I know for a lot of other reenactors, it's very distressing, but it is just a continuation of a situation that developed under COVID, where events will be cancelled a few weeks before they're supposed to happen, and the reason will be given online, and that's really it. There's nothing you can do. So it leaves us, being thankful for the events that we can get. And I had the same situation last year where I just went to everything, and I think at this stage, regardless of, we talk about this public events question a lot, I'm just going to go to everything that I can get to, and just leave it at that.
I think that's a good response. I mean, I struggle with this kind of thing, whether to feel outraged, and I could definitely see a reason to feel outraged and to be sort of galvanized into action by it. And I could also see that for some people this could just be totally demoralizing, where people are just going to walk away and say, to hell with all of this stuff, this is ridiculous.
Well, Chris, you and I have talked about this a lot. It is honestly devastating when you have an event that you might be excited for, and then it gets canceled, like last minute. Like the more last minute it gets canceled, like the more that gives people time to get excited for it, and then that makes the letdown even greater. And especially for some geopolitical reason, I can understand the frustration is immense.
Yeah, I mean, it must be profound. I would think it would be profoundly demoralizing. Ludwig, thinking back about the letter that you read, to hear they're voicing this idea that they're afraid of protesters picketing at the event, it's so chilling to me, because it's not like these protesters ever actually manifested anywhere, but they are just afraid of social activist protesters showing up to make their event look bad. What is this? How does this bode well for public reenactments of any kind going forward?
Yeah, there is the potential for that. I think the main thing is that what I hope is this is how it plays out, that these events cancel, and this is potentially the third time in the last 3 years that they've cancelled. And then at the same time, the bigger events which sort of crack on, they still go on. We've got 2 big events coming up in the summer, one of which is really big and has shown no indication of cancelling so far. These events go ahead and are massively successful, and that and there are no protesters or anything like that, and it's just a testament to the fact that people really in the public, if they're already willing to come to a show where Waffen SS are portrayed, they're probably not going to be too worried about seeing Red Army soldiers either. And the event that I was just at, I've been to 2 public events recently. One of them was in Haworth in West Yorkshire, and that was ridiculously well attended. It was absolutely people packed in like sardines on the streets. Certainly not the most authentic event by any means, but no people with problems about Ukraine or anything like that. And there were Ukrainian flags flying. We could talk about whether that's appropriate. Personally, I don't think it is, but it was, I guess their way of showing solidarity with how they're feeling and still having the event at the same time. Conversely, I've just come back yesterday from an event at Belver Castle near Grantham, or Belver Castle, I'm not sure how it's pronounced correctly, and that was fantastic. Really well received by the public. We had, your usual Battle of the Bowling Green public battle reenactment to show off the firing and so on, and really well received by the public, and no comments about the Ukraine. So I think a lot of this is very much imaginary, but it is certainly concerning that event organisers can be so scared by the hypothetical into just cancelling events which are potentially very well attended and very popular, but also for themselves potentially quite profitable as well if they're privately run, or if they are run by committees and so on, they will need that money to run the event in the future as well.
This is the first time I've ever heard the Battle of the Bowling Green phrase. What does that mean?
Well, we know how ridiculous public battles really are, and in a way, if you wanted anything that was tasteless about Second World War reenacting, it would be the Battle of the Bowling Green, and it's really where reenactors are brought to a show. Here's an empty field. There's probably no cover in it. You might be lucky if somebody's put out a couple of ammunition crates, or maybe there's a tree somewhere.
Straw bale?
Straw bale. Yeah, straw bale. Or I don't know if you guys have ever had pallets, sideways pallets, or even just a Hessian bag that's been kind of strung out with two poles, so it looks like a beigeish wall. And then you have to have essentially the Second World War microcosmed into this tiny little bowling green. And everybody's packed together that in reality one person with a submachine gun could just sort of spray them all and that would be it. But because it has to go on as long as possible and look like Saving Private Ryan for the public, it's drawn out to potentially dangerous levels where people are so close to each other shooting.
Let me guess, the grass is perfectly manicured.
It is perfectly manicured every time. Actually, at this one it wasn't. It had just been mown, so I think everybody's hay fever was playing up. It does give you an idea of Battle of the Bowling Green. We can export that from the UK to the US, but I'm sure it's just as applicable.
Excellent, I love it. Battle of the Bowling Green. That's really funny.
Fantastic.
But just to go back to it, the people that run these events, a lot of the time, I think they actually hate German reenactors. They have a very dim, and perhaps reenactors generally, but they have an extremely dim view of German reenactors. And they cast all sorts of aspersions about German reenactors and their politics and whatnot. And it just brings me back to this. Why would anybody want to reenact and essentially bring in money and potentially, bring in a lot of benefits for these people that in fact really, really quite dislike them? So I hope that moving forward, reenactors start to think about this. I'm not saying that's the case for... And public shows, you've got a totally different crowd of reenactors in a lot of cases. So I know a lot of the people that listen to this, the Reenactors Corner podcast specifically, this won't be relevant because they don't really do public shows and they don't care about them. And that's totally understandable. But if any of them were, that they go to these railway events or similar events, if any of them were listening, I would just say maybe next year think about, do we really want to go back to these shows?
Well, Chris and I have talked about how there's a place for everything, and even if public fortes are not your forte, and they're not strictly my forte, but I have observed that, with COVID and the change in the political climate in America and the world at large, as public events have declined, I feel like reenactment has been on the downturn as well in terms of its accessibility and popularity and numbers overall. So I feel like if public events go down, reenactment as a whole goes down. Even if, you or your unit doesn't strictly do them, there is a knock-on effect.
Well, that's kind of a big picture thing, and I'm sure that that's different depending on where people live. I'm sure there are places in the world where private events are kind of on the upswing. Living here in America, I think that what we're experiencing, a large part of what we're experiencing is just a transition where reenactment as a whole, I think, in my opinion, is going from being a rather mainstream thing that's kind of generally known about and sort of lampooned in the culture, and people know about the Civil War reenactment that you can go to in your town on a weekend in August or whatever it is. I think we're transitioning away from that, and I think we're transitioning into a thing where reenactment is going to be more of a niche thing. It's not going to have I just don't even think it's going to have the public face that it has had. I don't think that it could maintain that public face even if that's what we wanted. And, I think that's okay. There was a time in American history where reenactment was not a mainstream thing, and nevertheless it existed and people participated in it. And I think that's how things are going to be going forward. But I think it's, we might have some fits and starts, and it might be a little bit of a struggle for people to sort of realize the way the wind is blowing here. That's my opinion anyway.
I like that take, Chris. I think that's hopeful and not too gloomy, and I think that's solid.
Ludwig, you mentioned the Ukrainian flags a couple of times, and I did want to just touch on that a little bit. I totally do agree with you that, in my opinion, modern politics should be totally avoided at reenactment. I don't think that people should be... to be perfectly honest, even like in America here now, gun control being a hot button issue. Obviously, a lot of reenactors are gun owners. A lot of reenactors are opposed to further restrictions on firearms that might affect the hobby. Despite that, I wouldn't even feel comfortable going to an event and setting up near somebody who has, a pro Second Amendment, anti-gun control sign or statement anywhere having anything to do with their reenactment historical display. I think you're just opening the door to uncomfortable political conversations. I don't think it has any place in our hobby. I think our hobby should be totally backward facing, meaning history facing, and not having, I really think there should be no tolerance in taking stands on modern political issues of any kind, never mind controversial hot button type stuff where people are emotional about it. It just seems like a recipe for disaster to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree on that, Chris. I do.
Yeah, 100%. And I would say that it applies in so many ways. It applies, firstly, at a public event. Whatever uniform you're wearing, you shouldn't be talking about politics. It's inappropriate. People have come away to get away from the world. The last thing they want to hear is your talking on political subjects, no matter how, whether it's taxes or the war in Ukraine, whatever it might be. It's just not what we're there for. And I think that whether it's in that kind of area where the public can hear you, or alternatively where it's internally in your group, I think, speaking from my own experiences, every single time we end up in a political discussion in the group, it goes badly, and people dislike each other, or start to dislike each other, or briefly dislike each other for the wrong reasons, because we've started talking about politics, when really that's not why we're there at all. And when we're not talking about politics, when we're just enjoying the hobby that we love, everybody's getting along fine because politics hasn't been mentioned. I think, if anything, politics is the poison when it comes to reenacting. The two are so totally incompatible. And I guess you could broaden that out to any hobby, really. People come away to do these things to not have to deal with the real world and all of its ongoings, and they don't want to think about any of this stuff. They just want to focus on enjoying themselves and doing what they're doing, and it should be completely backwards facing. And to tie it into modern politics, no matter how how objectively good you think a cause is or isn't, or whatever it may be, to tie it into modern politics is, in my view, a death sentence for reenacting. Because then people can turn around and just as easily they could say that, you're campaigning for all of these causes. Reenacting is a fundamentally political hobby. Ergo, all of these people that choose to portray an SA formation, an SS formation, whatever, that's an inclination as to their political opinions, or vice versa, a Soviet formation. And as a consequence of that, then they can look at taking steps to address that in a way that I know a lot of people probably would, which would be to get rid of reenacting in any way that they could. And I did notice, just to touch on it, I did notice when we were discussing the Ukraine subject and discussing tonight's podcast, is somebody had commented on one of the posts asking about this, stating that history making and the telling of history is not immune to the current political milieu. If anything, it is a reflection of contemporary political discourse. I don't understand how somebody could believe something so utterly asinine, but also so potentially devastating to reenacting. I think it's obviously somebody that really would like to see elements of the hobby shut down. And I just, I don't know what your guys' opinion is on that, but to me it seems to be utterly ludicrous.
I can't imagine anything taking place in modern society, culture, the geopolitical situation that is going to affect my passion for history and my interest in experimental archaeology, or even learning about the material culture of the past, or sharing that information with other people, whether it's online or even at certain public type events. It's just, I don't know. There's the connection there just escapes me, and it's like, I look at even the guys in my own reenactment group and their political stances and opinions, and it just totally runs the gamut. There are people in there who, if you were to name any political or ideological issue, I think, within reason, you could find people even in just my small reenactment group that have opposite takes on that. And so, we as reenactors, there should not be any expectation that we should all speak with one voice really about any issue. We all have our own politics, our own ideas and attitudes about things, but we're all interested in history, and that is why I think we should be here. For me, reenacting is a history-related endeavor. It's not like that I'm just a fan of war. I'm not some kind of military fetishist or fanboy. The fact that there is a war going on and that militaries elsewhere in the world are going at it right now, that to me has nothing to do with my fascination with a period of history that happened long before I was born. These things there's just connections that people make to this stuff that I just really don't see.
Sure, I mean, I think in the past year I haven't done as many events because I've just been busy with my personal life, but I still am reading about, things which happen in World War II every day. I'm still collecting, and I still plan on going to events, and so it's, I don't see myself really changing all that much on this, and another point, I feel like this is a kind of a risky opinion to make, but I've heard it said by people of an older generation that politics used to be a little bit more polite, at least in terms of the parties respecting each other and people being able to find common ground. But in the last 20 years, that political candidates are just more rude to each other, and people are just more polarized. And I'm not saying that like 20 years ago and before that, people were very polite to each other, but I do feel like there might be something to be said for that, where we are living in a increasingly polarized world, and there's a danger in that, and we're seeing it in the hobby now too.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of danger in the future. I definitely, I think, we've touched on this many times previously on the program, that reenactors need to have some sense that other people in the reenactment community aren't going to go blasting them on social media and creating an online outrage mob because they participate in this hobby, and it has been, I mean, if there's anything good about this terrible, horrible situation in Ukraine, where people are suffering and dying, as far as it goes to reenactment, right? It's that on some level, I think this is an opportunity for us to see who's who a little bit. There have been some comments that have come out that I've seen on social media from people where I realize, okay, well, this person isn't necessarily the person who I thought they were, or there's an ideological something there that's not what I would have expected. I mean, Ludwig, do you know what I'm talking about here at all?
I know that there are people that I think as otherwise quite intelligent human beings that are not being in any way, they're not looking at this in a sort of sensible step back way. Every single hysterical thing that comes out, they are first in line to believe it, and it is made me very cautious about some of the people that I would choose to associate with otherwise, because if they're willing to believe that, what else are they willing to believe?
Well, yeah, like I say, I do World War II German and Soviet reenacting, and there's nothing that could happen in a modern political sense that could get me to stop doing one of those things. Everything that happened up until 1945 already happened, and World War II is over. There is no further development of World War II. On the other hand, I see people who suddenly, as a result of the war in Ukraine, are taking a totally different approach to how they view their own impressions. They're trying to distance themselves from aspects of reenacting that they previously had championed, although, nothing has changed with reenacting, right? Something changed with interaction between two nation states elsewhere in the world. And what I realize is that these people are, in fact, they maybe are on some level ideologically motivated, where they are personally mentally identifying with some other nation somehow in their mind. I don't really understand it. I feel like I've seen a lot of people kind of expose who they really are and how they really feel, and on some level there's been some enlightenment that has happened for me through all this.
Sadly so. I mean, I feel like reenacting is inherently an escapist hobby. And, Chris and I, we've talked about sort of the atomization of social groups as a whole in society, which is its own topic. But I feel like, some people, for, lack of whatever in their life, they might get oddly attached to, some faction in a war thousands of miles away or something, So, yeah, it's my...
Right, where people make it part of their identity.
Exactly, and they get worked up if somebody says something against that faction or in support of the opposite faction in a different country, that they might not even have any sort of ethnic or, cultural tie to previously.
Another aspect of it, and I'm not wanting to pick on anybody, and I certainly am not telling anybody how they should feel about anything, but to see reenactors gleefully sharing what is essentially war propaganda on social media to support one side or the other, I don't know, I just might have hoped on some level that across the board, as historians, amateur historians who are interested in this wartime period that was so rife with propaganda, right, during World War II, that maybe there would be a little bit more awareness or introspection that would take place before people would eagerly lap up and repeat modern military propaganda, but in some cases apparently perhaps not.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that, a lot of what you could call fake news being shared around and whatnot, and even beyond that, just news that's definitely biased. And I feel like the final record on the Ukraine war, we probably won't know everything, for years down the line. And if anything, I mean, it's insightful into how things might have happened or been perceived in World War II, but it's also kind of sad that people who study World War II are not immune to this,
I think it's fascinating in a sense, and it's awful that it's fascinating because it is an ongoing conflict and people are dying and everything that's going on there. But it does put this was a question I put to the guys in our group and that I thought about myself is, imagine if there'd been social media during the Second World War. Would people believe these things which are spread around, which are clearly false, which make no sense, which are logistically impossible, which don't correlate to the reality on the ground from what we can actually objectively see if we try and really dig into it, rather than just looking at Facebook posts? Would they believe it in the same way? Would there be Facebook posts from German troops at Kursk, I think that side of it is very interesting. I think a lot of reenactors have, as you say, these people who I know very well who will fixate on things, research them constantly to try and get the answers, are accepting at face value things which would seem to be just looking at the real situation to be very clearly untrue. And I think in terms of looking at how the history of this will be written, that will be perhaps an interesting story all of its own, of the information war that's been conducted at the same time and how this has had such an impact on our society and seemingly shifted overnight tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people that didn't care about this issue to suddenly it's something that they care about tremendously and are extremely knowledgeable about. A lot of people I know who've never mentioned anything about the Ukraine, despite this being an issue since the 1990s, are suddenly, great armchair generals on the subject, and they know the history of the Ukraine back to the Kievan Rus just by the last, since February the 25th. That's what they become. So I think that side of things is very interesting. But I think what will happen for a lot of these people that are very invested in that sort of thing, I think they might get some very big surprises when the propaganda comes down. And that perhaps will draw some parallels with the Second World War, with some of the hysterical German propaganda at the end of the Second World War,
Sure.
when they're trying to hold on and so on and so forth. But interestingly, I have noted this has come up when war crime stuff has been discussed, and I have had to sort of draw things back to where war crimes have been discussed historically. During the First World War, there were a lot of stories about the Germans in Belgium committing the most disgusting war crimes, and these were fired by Allied propaganda. They were a big thing in the British press, where this idea of the Pickelhauwearing Hun stabbing babies to death and all sorts of wild stuff. And of course, all of this stuff became clearly untrue in the post-war period. But these things obviously have a lasting cultural impact. And this idea of the Russian as storming through the Ukraine and butchering his way through there, and the fact that these stories are being believed without question. And I'm not saying they're untrue. I just think that, as a lot of people who would view this thing skeptically would like to wait until things perhaps have cooled down before reviewing them, these things might be found to be untrue, but nonetheless will have a lasting cultural impact. And when things like that come about, I think I definitely wouldn't like to be a Soviet reenactor in that sense, where people might be in this very heated attitude of, everything Russian is bad. So that's why I think in that sense we should definitely look at these things with a bit of, and I would expect from reenactors who are so fixated on getting things right and focusing on things and researching things, perhaps a little bit more of a discerning outlook.
Well, what are many reenactors fixated on getting right? Is it understanding the exact cultural and geopolitical situation from 1939 to 1945, or is it the production of uniforms and helmets and whatnot, and what exactly is the exact correct style of hobnail to have in your boot? I feel like reenactors run the gambit, but I feel like there's sort of cultural understanding and there's material culture understanding, and maybe you can sort of go all in on one but then be a bit more susceptible to the other, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no doubt, and I completely agree. And you're absolutely right in that sense, and reenactors can be very good at telling you what a mess kit is, and on the converse side they can't tell you strategic level operations that decided the Second World War, and that's kind of understandable. What I'm trying to convey is that they tend to, on their whatever specific element it is that they're talking about, they tend to focus and try to get things right. I know that's quite perhaps you could look at that statement subjectively, but they try to be as accurate as understanding of it as possible on whatever, whether it's material culture or the actual history of the war, whatever it might be. So where they're dealing with these stories, which are often quite wild, you would think that they might take a similar approach, but apparently not. But maybe that plays into entirely what you've just said, and while somebody's very good at telling you where a particular model of Kar-98 was produced, they're not very good at understanding geopolitics or strategic level operations or anything like that.
Yeah, that's my unfortunate observation, and your mileage may vary, but just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Ludwig, we're running out of time. I wanted to ask you, while I've got you here, how are things going with your group?
Good. We are struggling with a couple of different things at the moment, I feel. Very strong numbers turning out, which is great, but we're sort of going through the process of merging another group into ourselves at the moment and trying to keep everybody at the same standard and trying to have the same sort of unit culture. Equally, I'm still running the long conversation with several different manufacturers based in the sort of the Far East and Pakistan to try and finally get the perfected cuff title for portraying the different Felder and Haller formations, and that has been an ongoing and not very enjoyable sort of, when we talk about reenactors focusing on things, trying to get them to use the correct weave and to print the text into the weave and all this sort of stuff. But I think I might just be on the cusp of that now. So once that's done, we can finally start getting those dished out. So I'm excited for that. But all in all, I would say good. We've had some great events so far this year, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the year. And ideally, it will, Ukraine and everything else notwithstanding, be a good year for us.
Yeah, it sounds like you're still keeping busy, even despite the event cancellations, that you still have plenty of events to go to, so that's really good.
Yeah, as I say, this year is, for me personally, it's just going to be about going to as many as I can, because I just get the feeling that it's going to be another summer of looking at events pages and seeing that the cancellation notice has appeared. But we'll wait and see.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed for peace for the Ukraine, and who knows? I mean, things could get better, they could get worse, right? Let's hope they're going to get better.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Think positively, so to speak.
All right, Ludwig, thank you so much for coming on again. It's been really great talking to you again, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective and time, so thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you again, Ludwig. Nice to meet you, and this is a good chat.
You too. Thanks for having me, guys.
Okay, so for Ben, Ludwig, and I, to everybody else out there, I will see you in the field.
See you in the field.
We love hearing what you think about the podcast. So why not let us know by reaching out in all the usual places: Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Just search for The Reenactors Corner and you'll find us there.
And maybe think about supporting us via Patreon. No matter how big or small, your monthly donations make a huge difference.
And as ever, thanks to Mike, aka Retroman, for editing the podcast.
We hope you enjoyed it and will join us here again at The Reenactors Corner.